When the Vikings attacked England, the attack on Lindisfarne for sleep and relaxation. Intro: a distant shoreline. The wind is low tonight, moving softly across the open water, brushing the long grasses that bend along the rocky edge where sea meets land in a rhythm as old as the coast itself, unhurried and unbroken, a quiet breathing that continues even when no one listens. The waves arrive with care, as if they know they are guests here, laying themselves gently against stones darkened by centuries of salt and tide, while in the distance, beyond the reach of the eye, seabirds call into a sky that is slowly cooling, its last warmth slipping into the sea as evening gathers. This is Lindisfarne, what many once called the Holy Island, set just off the northeastern coast of what we now know as England, separated from the mainland by a causeway that appears and disappears with the tide, a narrow stretch of sand and stone that allows passage only when the sea permits, reminding all who come here that the island belongs first and always to the water. Today, it is a place of stillness. A quiet outpost of memory. Low ruins sleep where once tall stone walls rose, echoing with song and prayer, and now it is only footsteps that stir the silence, pilgrims walking slow paths between sea and sky, following not voices, but echoes, as the rhythm of liturgy has long since faded into the rhythm of tide and wind and time. But long ago, in a year marked by unease and by signs that people of the time believed came not from men, but from something greater or more terrifying still, this island was not so quiet, not so safe. It was here, in the summer of the year 793, that something happened, something that would come to be remembered not only for its violence, though there was violence, and not only for its shock, though it shocked even those who thought they had seen all, that would be remembered because it seemed to open a door that would never fully close again. That summer, out of the sea to the north, came ships, unfamiliar in shape and shadow, long and low, with their carved prows lifting like beasts from the deep, cutting swiftly and surely through the water until they reached this quiet, sacred shore. And from those ships stepped men, not known to the people of this island, not kin, not pilgrims, but strangers in every sense, in their language, in their weapons, in their intent. And when they came ashore, they brought not gifts, but fire. This was not the first time that seafarers had crossed great distances in search of something more than what they left behind. But it was, so far as the written record tells us, the first time that such men arrived in such a place and left such a deep scar on the world's imagination. And for that reason, because it marked a change not only in what was done, but in how it was understood, this moment would later be remembered as the beginning of something vast and violent and uncertain. The beginning of what we now call the Viking Age. But before we sail out into that story, before we follow the longships into the unknown, before we try to trace the lines of blood and fear and silver that would come to define an era, we begin here, on this island, on this shoreline, in the moment before the sails are seen, before the breath catches in the throat, before the silence is broken. This episode is not only about what happened here, it is also about what it meant, both then and now, about how this place, once sacred and remote, came to carry the weight of 1,000 retellings, about how one small island became the stage for the beginning of something far larger than itself. And so, we move slowly now. Without rush, without judgment, without conclusion, into the still layers of this moment in time, seeking not only the facts, but the feeling beneath them. We will walk the edges of Lindisfarne and the years that surround it, guided not by the need to explain everything, but by a quiet attention to what can still be felt. And as we do, we carry with us questions, simple, essential, unanswered, or only half answered. What kind of place was Lindisfarne before the ships came? What did it mean, and to whom? Why was it so sacred, so exposed, and so rich in both spirit and treasure? Who were the men who landed here, and what were they seeking? Why did they come? How did they travel such a distance, and what gave them the power to strike where others had only prayed? What happened on that day? What do the sources say, and what do they leave unsaid? How did the world respond? How did kings and monks and ordinary people understand such a rupture in the order of things? Was this really the first Viking raid, or merely the first that struck a chord loud enough to echo across centuries? Why did it come when it did, and why here? What did it mean for the centuries that followed, for England, for Europe, for the Norse world itself? And what remains of it now? What do we hear when we stand on this same shore over 1,000 years later? When we let the silence stretch across the centuries like mist over the water? When the wind carries nothing but the memory of sails, and the stones beneath our feet remember what was taken? This will be a slow journey. There will be no noise, no urgency, no dramatic turns. Only the patient unfolding of a story long buried in salt and silence. So let us begin, as all things begin. Not with the storm, but with the calm that came before it. With stillness, with distance, with waves against stone, with a quiet island, before the world came knocking. Part 1. A Sacred Island. Before the ships came, before the shouting and the smoke, before the silence of prayer was broken by the rhythm of boots on stone and blades on flesh, there was only the island, resting as it had for centuries between land and sea, neither fully separate nor fully connected, surrounded not only by water, but by a kind of reverence that had grown slowly, season by season, as the centuries turned and faith took root in the soil. Lindisfarne, or Holy Island as it came to be known, was not a grand place in size, nor a place of wealth in the way courts or cities were wealthy, but it was a place that carried meaning, deep and layered and quiet, meaning built not with gold or walls, but with belief, with the steady rhythm of prayer and the passing of time in service of something beyond this world. And though its fame would one day be tied to what was taken from it, it was first known for what was kept there, the sacred words of Scripture, the bones of saints, the discipline of solitude, the beauty of devotion. The island lies just off the northeastern coast of the British mainland, in what is today the county of Northumberland, and though the water that separates it from the land is shallow and calm at low tide, it rises quickly when the sea returns, swallowing the causeway and reminding all who travel there that this is a place apart, not entirely of the world it borders, and even in modern times, the timing of arrival and departure is dictated not by roads or rail, but by the ancient pull of the tides. Back then, in the early 700s, Lindisfarne was already a name of importance. The monastery was founded around the year 634, by Saint Aidan, a monk from the island of Iona, who had been invited by King Oswald of Northumbria to bring Christianity to the north, and from the beginning, it was a place of learning and discipline, of scriptural study and missionary work, where monks lived simply, worked with their hands, and walked long distances barefoot to spread the word of Christ to a still half-pagan land. They built their church from timber, gathered their food from the earth and the sea, wrote their prayers in Latin and whispered them in the stillness of the dawn, and slowly, as the years passed, the monastery became not just a center of faith, but a beacon of spiritual authority, a quiet axis around which the newly Christian kingdom of Northumbria began to turn. One of the most revered figures to live and die there was Cuthbert, a monk and later bishop, who became known for his piety, his simplicity, and the miracles said to have followed him in life and in death. When he died in 687, his body was buried on the island, and over time, his shrine drew pilgrims from far away, who came to seek healing, guidance, or simply to stand in the presence of one whose holiness seemed to linger in the very air. By the end of the 8th century, the monastery was home to not only monks, but scribes and scholars, artisans who produced illuminated manuscripts like the Lindisfarne Gospels, a book of extraordinary beauty and detail, with pages filled not only with scripture, but with spirals and interlacing patterns that seemed to lift the words toward the divine, and although created by human hands, the manuscript glowed with a kind of reverence that made it something more than a book. It became a prayer made visible, a testimony of both faith and craftsmanship. The monks lived a life that was both disciplined and deeply rooted in nature. They rose before the sun, sang psalms in the still dark of morning, worked in gardens or copied texts by the flickering light of oil lamps, and though their days were filled with silence and repetition, they were also filled with purpose, with the belief that what they were doing, preserving words, practicing humility, waiting in patience, was not only for their own souls, but for the world beyond the island's edge. They lived close to the land, but also beyond it. Their lives were hard, but not bitter. Their walls were simple, but the space within them was sacred. And because of all this, because of its spiritual role, its royal connections, its beauty and its treasure, both literal and intangible, Lindisfarne stood not just as a quiet island, but as a symbol of something greater, a place where the divine had touched the earth, where time moved differently, and where the boundaries between heaven and sea and land seemed thin. But that same beauty, that same devotion, also made it vulnerable. There were no walls high enough to keep danger away. No soldiers posted at the shore. No warning system to sound the alarm. The very things that made the island holy, its peace, its humility, its isolation, also made it exposed. And so, when the sails appeared on the horizon, when the narrow ships slipped through the dawn and came to rest in the shallows, there was no army to meet them, only monks rising for prayer, perhaps hearing oars before they saw them, perhaps thinking they were visitors or traders or pilgrims, perhaps not thinking at all, before it was too late. But that is still to come. For now, the island breathes as it always has, quietly and alone, held between sea and sky, full of prayer and purpose, unaware that it is about to become a doorway through which a new and darker chapter of history will begin to pass. Part 2: The Age Before the Storm. The world does not change all at once, not usually, not with a single blow or a single ship or a single cry in the dark, but rather slowly, like clouds gathering on the edge of the sky, like a tide that seems to hesitate before it rises, like something just out of sight that draws closer one quiet hour at a time, until suddenly it is here, and then it seems, in memory, as though it had always been coming. In the years before 793, the island of Lindisfarne and the land around it lay within the kingdom of Northumbria, one of several Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in what is now England, a region shaped not only by its fields and rivers and rocky shores, but by its shifting kings and uncertain borders, where alliances could be made and broken in the same season, and where power was often a matter of who held the sword, and who could claim the blessing of the church. Northumbria was strong, by the standards of the time, with kings who styled themselves both warriors and protectors of the faith, rulers who built monasteries, supported bishops, and sought to bind the spiritual to the political in a way that made their rule seem ordained, not just earned, but for all its strength, the kingdom was not without cracks. Beneath the surface of royal titles and Christian banners, there were tensions, between old customs and new laws, between local chieftains and distant kings, between what was spoken in court and what was remembered in the fields, and these tensions, though often silent, shaped the land like wind shapes stone, slowly but unavoidably. The church was growing, not only in numbers, but in wealth, and the monasteries, once humble outposts built with timber and humility, had begun to gather treasures, gifts from kings, relics from saints, books bound in leather and adorned with gold, crosses of silver, chalices encrusted with gems, and though these objects were meant to honor the divine, they also made the monasteries targets for those who did not share their faith, or who shared it only thinly. Beyond the island and the kingdom, the larger world was restless. To the west, the Franks were rising, under the rule of a king named Charlemagne, who would soon be crowned emperor by the Pope, forging a new empire in the image of Rome, backed by swords and sacraments alike. To the east, Slavic peoples were moving, settling, trading, expanding. To the south, the Islamic world was flourishing, mathematics, medicine, philosophy, poetry, all growing beneath the domes of Baghdad and Cordoba. And far to the north, in the inlets and fjords of what we now call Norway and Denmark and Sweden, something was stirring too. The people who lived in these lands were not yet Vikings in the way we speak of them today. They were farmers, fishermen, traders, craftsmen, people whose lives were shaped by the seasons, by kinship ties, by old beliefs and oral traditions and the hard truths of the northern climate, but they were also people with boats, and with growing confidence, and with stories of lands beyond the horizon where silver flowed like water and monasteries rose like beacons, unguarded, unarmed, rich beyond imagining. It is hard to say when the idea began to take root, that the sea might offer not just fish, but fortune, that the distant coastlines might be reached not only in trade, but with steel, but it seems that by the late 8th century, small groups had already begun to sail further, testing the waters, learning the winds, listening to the tales told by travelers and traders, and wondering what lay just beyond the edge of their world. Some had gone west, to the Shetlands and the Orkneys. Some had found the Hebrides. And some, perhaps, had already heard the name Lindisfarne, carried in the mouths of merchants, murmured in stories passed hand to hand. And then, there were the signs. Strange portents were recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, that most sparse and sober of sources, which tells us that in the year 793, immense flashes of lightning were seen, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the sky, and whether these were meteors, or comets, or storms, or only the imagination of frightened men, they were understood as warnings, as signs from heaven, and when the attack came, it was not seen as an isolated act, but as part of something deeper, more cosmic, more terrifying. The monk Alcuin of York, writing from the court of Charlemagne, asked how such a thing could happen, how God could allow his sacred places to be defiled, how the pagans could be permitted to strike so cruelly at the heart of Christendom, and his questions, written with sorrow and urgency, reflected the unease that had already begun to spread, the sense that something had shifted, that the world had tilted, that the age of certainty was ending. But before the raid, before the flames and the cries and the silence that followed, there had been only slow gathering, the gathering of ambition, of knowledge, of ships and oars and quiet intentions, and like a storm not yet broken, it hung above the water, waiting for the moment when all things would change. And in the summer of 793, the moment came. Part 3. Who were the Vikings? They came from the sea, that much is certain, and yet the sea itself does not preserve names, nor does it concern itself with history, for it remembers only the shape of movement, the creak of wood against wave, the rhythm of oars moving steadily through salt water, and the long quiet of sails swelling in wind that carries no flag, only direction. The men who stepped ashore on the island of Lindisfarne in the summer of the year 793 did not leave behind scrolls with names or intentions, no inscription carved in stone to explain what they sought or whom they served, but still, from the traces left in language, in legend, and in the slow accumulation of memory, we can begin to imagine who they might have been, not with certainty or sharp outlines, but with the soft precision of a scene glimpsed through mist, felt more than seen. They likely came from what we now call Norway, perhaps from the western coastline where fjords stretch like fingers deep into the rock, where steep pastures hang above cold inlets, and where the sea is not a boundary but a road, not something to cross in fear, but something to follow in familiarity, because it was there from the beginning, present in every task, in every story, in every thought about what lay beyond. These men may have been the sons of farmers or fishermen, chieftains or craftsmen, and though they were not kings in the European sense, they may have led others, or followed a trusted leader, bound together by oath, by blood, or by the sheer necessity of sharing a boat across many days and nights, under skies that offered both guidance and mystery. They were not strangers to hardship, nor to the elements, for their lives were shaped by the demands of a northern climate, where winters are long, where crops are uncertain, and where survival depends on skill, cooperation, and courage. But they also lived in a culture of beauty and story, of songs passed mouth to mouth, of images carved into wood and stone, and of gods who walked among men not as distant judges, but as fellow wanderers through the changing world. They would not have called themselves Vikings, at least not as a collective name, for in the beginning, the word was more an activity than a title. It described the act of setting out on expedition, of raiding, of seeking wealth or reputation or revenge, and only later, after years of conflict in memory and writing, did it harden into an identity used by those who feared them more than those who bore the name. Perhaps they thought of themselves simply as Norse, or as men of a certain place, sons of a fjord, brothers of a house, crewmen of a particular ship whose name was whispered with pride among the coastal stones of home. They would have spoken Old Norse, a language shaped by wind and winter and long silence, a language dense with metaphor and memory, where the sea might be called the whale road, and a sword might be known as wound ice, where every word carried not only its meaning but a history of how it had been spoken, sung, and remembered. Their gods were many and close at hand, not locked away in temples, but present in the trees, in thunder, in sacrifice, and in feast, gods like Odin, who gave an eye for wisdom and hung from the world tree for 9 nights to gain the runes, Thor, who guarded the order of the world with his hammer and his strength, Freya, who wept tears of gold and rode a chariot drawn by cats, and others, less known to us now, but no less real to those who named them in the dark and asked for favor when the sea grew wild. They were not unskilled, though they did not read books. They were not crude, though they built no cities. They knew how to work iron and wood, how to mend sails and preserve fish, how to build with turf and stone, how to tell a tale that kept a room silent, how to die well and be remembered. Their world, though small in terms of geography, was vast in imagination, because it held the belief that one could leave, that there were things worth seeking beyond the edge of the known, and that return was not the only form of victory. Some of them, perhaps, had already gone Viking before, to smaller islands or settlements, probing the edges of the world beyond, testing what could be taken, what could be traded, what could be done with a ship and a will and a crew willing to follow. But whatever had come before, it left little trace, and so when they stepped ashore at Lindisfarne, it was as if they emerged from silence itself, marking the first clear imprint in what would soon become a well-trodden path. Were they cruel? It is possible. Were they desperate? Perhaps. Were they brave? Certainly, because it takes courage to row into the unknown, to risk the fury of gods not your own, to challenge a place built on prayer with only an axe and a belief in what might come next. But above all, they were human, with hands that had known calluses and blood, with eyes that had watched stars from a boat's deck, with ears tuned to wind and warning, and with hearts pulled by something not easily named, whether greed or glory or restlessness or simply the strange desire to know what happens when one walks ashore in a place where no one expects them to arrive. And as they stood that morning at the edge of the monastery, looking up at the timbered chapel and the low stone walls, at the carved crosses and open doors, at the monks in robes who froze not in welcome but in dread, perhaps they felt something stirring inside them, something ancient, something cold, something powerful, or perhaps they felt nothing at all, only the quiet knowledge that this place, so sacred to others, was now theirs to enter. Part 4, The Crossing. They left under gray skies, perhaps, or beneath the slow burn of a midsummer sun, rolling gently away from the fjord with its steep green walls and its soundless watchers of stone and pine, the tide carrying them past familiar headlands and shadowed inlets, the shoreline slowly shrinking behind them until the trees became lines and the mountains became memory and only the steady rhythm of the sea remained, folding in beneath the whole like a long-held breath returning home. There would have been little speech, perhaps, once the coast had vanished, not out of fear or solemnity, but because the men knew what the journey demanded and did not need to say what had already been said, for each of them had packed his silence as surely as he had packed his cloak, his axe, his dried fish, his whetstone, and the small carved amulet he wore around his neck or kept hidden in a pouch lined with wool, sacred not because a priest had touched it, but because it had passed through his father's hands or had been carved in the long dark of winter when the snow hung from the roof beams like the limbs of sleeping giants. The sea was not unknown to them, and yet it was never tamed, for each voyage, even a short one, carried the memory of those who had not returned, of ships that vanished in fog or fractured in storms, of bodies buried not beneath stone but beneath miles of black water, and so they watched the sky with care, reading the direction of the wind in the curve of a sail, in the feathering of cloud, in the way the salt hung in the air, and they studied the water too, its movement, its color, the feel of it under the keel, and though they had no compass, they had eyes trained by years of fishing, years of rowing, years of scanning the horizon for land or for danger, and they had the sun to guide them, the arc of it rising low in the sky in the early hours and falling westward in a slow sweep, and they knew, without thinking, how its warmth moved across their shoulders and what it meant when the shadows shifted. They may have followed the coastline for a time, hugging the edges of Scotland, tracing the line of the Shetlands or Orkneys or Hebrides, making camp when needed, pulling their ships ashore where the tide allowed, gathering driftwood, turning their backs to the wind and lighting fires low to keep smoke from rising, but eventually they would have turned outward, away from the land they knew, setting a course into the eastern sea, toward the islands and the wide estuaries of what we now call Northumbria, though they would not have known the name, nor needed it, only the direction, only the stories told by those who had returned with bright silver in their belts and scars on their arms and eyes that looked past you, into distances still moving. The ship they sailed was not large by modern measure, but it was enough, long and narrow and shallow of draught, designed to move swiftly over open sea and to glide silently into river mouths or across tidal flats, built from oak or pine, its planks overlapped and riveted with iron nails, its ribs shaped by hand and by fire, its sail dyed red or brown or left the color of raw flax, and when the wind failed, they rowed, each man taking his place without order being given, their muscles moving in a rhythm older than any of them, older than words, the long pull and lift of oar against wave echoing the breath in their lungs and the beat of their thoughts, which in those hours would have been as slow and as deep as the sea itself. They slept when they could, perhaps huddled beneath cloaks that smelled of wood smoke and salt, leaning against their shields or the curved timbers of the hull, their dreams filled not with glory, perhaps, but with the smell of home, with the sound of gulls above the farmstead, with the feel of a familiar path underfoot, or with nothing at all, just darkness and the distant rocking that the sea gives to those it has not yet claimed. They may have spoken, from time to time, in low voices, sharing stories, or sharpening blades, or passing a flask along the benches, not as celebration, but as comfort, for the voyage was not yet a raid, and their silence was not yet stained with blood, and though their minds may have turned toward what they would find, what they would take, what they would prove, for now, they were only men upon the water, crossing the unknown toward a place that was spoken of in murmurs and half-remembered names. And when at last they saw it, when the island rose before them, low and green and strangely quiet, when they glimpsed the outlines of stone walls and wooden roofs, when they heard no warning bells, no shouts, no soldiers, only the sound of seabirds and the lap of water against stone, they would have known that they had arrived not in a fortress, but in a place of peace, and that what lay ahead was not battle, but something far simpler, far more terrible, and far easier to begin. But for now, the ship still moves, slowly and without fanfare, riding the low swell of the sea as if it belongs to it, which it does, and the men within it are silent, which they must be, for the time of noise is not yet come, and the sea, which forgets nothing and promises nothing, continues to carry them forward, gently, as it always has. Part 5. The day the silence broke. The morning may have begun like any other on the island, with the long blue hush of the sky beginning to pale behind the outline of the hills, with the tide quietly withdrawing from the causeway, with the birds calling to one another from the rocks, and with the monks stirring in their cold stone cells, blinking away sleep and rising to prayer in rhythm with bells that marked the hours not by ambition, but by devotion, their feet bare against the flagstones, their robes drawn tight against the wind, their voices low, rising slowly into chant as they had done for years, for decades, for generations, believing that this place, this quiet island between sky and sea, stood apart from the danger and noise of the world beyond. They could not have known what was already drawing close, what shadows had already crossed the water, what decision had already been made somewhere offshore, as the ships moved inland with the tide, steady and silent and smooth as seals upon the surface, the men within them crouched low behind curved shields, their hands resting not in prayer but on axe handles and spear shafts, their breath measured, their eyes fixed on the smoke that rose from chimneys, on the glint of morning light against a bell tower, on the slow movement of robed figures among the buildings that stood, unguarded, open, holy. There were no walls, not in the way of fortresses or towns, only timber buildings and narrow paths, small gardens, storage sheds, a scriptorium perhaps, a chapel, a library with manuscripts laid open on slanted desks, half illuminated by the soft light through oiled parchment windows, and maybe the sound of footsteps in the grass as a novice walked to the well with a wooden bucket swinging lightly at his side, unaware that something was already watching, already choosing, already counting the moment. We do not know who saw them first, whether it was a monk at the edge of the shore, walking the path of morning prayer, or a cook tending the fire outside the kitchen, or a boy sent to collect driftwood, but someone must have looked out and seen the sails, and someone must have paused, uncertain, watching the long narrow forms approaching not like pilgrims, not like traders, but with a stillness that did not match the kindness of the light. Perhaps there was a moment of confusion, a reaching back into memory, a story told months before of strange men seen further south, of churches robbed, of monasteries emptied of their relics, and perhaps that moment passed too quickly for anyone to act, or perhaps it did not pass at all, for by then the men had already reached the shore, already jumped from the boats into knee-deep water, already begun to move up the sand with weapons drawn, moving not like strangers but like those who had rehearsed this moment in their minds 100 times before. The attack itself may have been brief, brutal, efficient, terrifying, not a battle in any formal sense, not a clash of armies or a contest of strength, but something closer to slaughter, to desecration, to the sudden tearing open of a world that had, until then, felt protected not only by its remoteness but by its sanctity. The monks were not warriors. Some ran. Some tried to speak. Some prayed. Some were taken. Some were killed. And the rest, we do not know, for the silence that followed swallowed their names, as fire swallowed the thatch, as boots trampled the garden beds, as hands pulled golden crosses from altars and tore pages from books to wrap treasures taken from the dead. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the attack happened in the same year that immense flashes of lightning had been seen and fiery dragons were flying in the sky, and whether these were meteors, auroras, or only symbols drawn by terrified men who saw in this attack not only cruelty, but a sign that the world itself had shifted, it is clear that what happened here was felt not only in blood, but in the deepest recesses of belief. Alcuin of York, a scholar writing from Charlemagne's court, asked how such a thing could be allowed, how pagans, as he called them, could strike the house of God without punishment, how those devoted to Christ could be left defenseless, and whether this meant that the church had failed, or the people had sinned, or the Lord himself had turned away. His words trembled with grief, with shame, with bewilderment, and with a kind of fear that was not only about what had happened, but about what it meant, that if even this place could be violated, then no place was safe, and if even monks could be slaughtered, then no life could claim immunity. But the Vikings, if we can call them that now, did not come to make a point. They came for what was valuable: silver, gold, objects of beauty and meaning, and though they may not have understood the sacredness of what they took, they understood its worth, and when they left, carrying the bones of saints and the pages of Gospels, the spoils of prayer and patience, they left behind a silence that was not the old silence of still mornings and psalms, but a new one, heavier, darker, filled with the echo of questions that had not yet been asked. And so the day ended, perhaps, with smoke rising into the evening air, drifting eastward over the sea, as the ships moved once more from land to water, lower in the water now, heavier with stolen things, and the island, wounded and burned, fell back into stillness, not the stillness of peace, but the stillness of aftermath, of something broken, something changed. And though the tide would come again, and though the bells would be repaired, and though the paths would once again be walked, the silence that remained would never be the same, for the sea had brought with it something more than strangers, something more than swords. It had brought the end of an age, and the beginning of something else. Part 6, A World Shaken. It takes only a moment for an axe to fall, for a prayer to be silenced, for the walls of certainty to crack beneath the weight of something unimagined, but it takes far longer for the sound of that moment to finish echoing, for its meaning to settle into the minds of those who were not there, yet who must now live in its shadow, in the long silence that comes not from peace, but from a grief too large to name. When word of the attack reached beyond the island, when travelers spoke of bodies left unburied and books torn and gold carried off by men whose names could not be spoken, when the news arrived at court and monastery and market, it did not bring with it the usual grief of far-off misfortune, but something more disorienting, more frightening, for it carried not only death, but disruption, and with it came the slow realization that the world had changed, not in a distant land, but here, on sacred ground, in the heart of a Christian kingdom, in a place once believed to be protected not by walls, but by faith. In the halls of learning, where monks bent over parchment and ink, there was confusion, and in the courts of kings, where advisers weighed power and profit, there was unease, but in the churches, where the faithful knelt before images of Christ and saints, there was something deeper still, something closer to dread, because if the Lord allowed such a thing to happen, if pagans could come ashore and slaughter his servants without warning or punishment, then what did it mean for the promises of Scripture, for the strength of sacraments, for the very structure of salvation? Alcuin of York, one of the most learned men of his age, a scholar and advisor to Charlemagne, wrote in sorrow and fear after learning of the attack, asking how such evil could reach the place of learning for the angels of God, and whether this violence was not merely a crime, but a punishment, a divine rebuke, a consequence of hidden sins or of a church grown soft or worldly. And in his letters he did not speak in politics or policy, but in lament, in the ancient language of exile and warning. As though the fall of Lindisfarne were the fall of Eden itself. Others, too, began to wonder, not only what had gone wrong, but what might come next, whether this was a single wound or the first blow of a greater storm, and in their wondering, they looked for signs, not only in reports and rumors, but in the sky itself, in the strange lights seen months earlier, in the weather, in the turning of birds, in the tremor of the earth, and as they watched, they remembered the old stories, the ones half buried by Christian teaching but not yet forgotten, stories of fire from the sea, of gods who walked as wolves, of ends that began with smoke and sea and steel. The sense of safety was broken, not only on the coastlines of Northumbria, but across the shores of all Christian Europe, for if an island so devoted, so humble, so clearly chosen by God could be laid waste, then who among them was safe, and what protection could walls or prayers truly offer? Kings met with councils, bishops wrote to Rome, guards were posted along estuaries, and coastal monasteries, those quiet outposts of script and silence, began to build stone defenses, not because they had become less faithful, but because they had become less sure that faith alone would be enough. Some called for retaliation, though there was little to strike, for the raiders had vanished into the sea, into lands unknown, into names unspoken, and there were no borders to cross, no fortresses to siege, only the soft retreat of waves and the hollow space they left behind. The attack on Lindisfarne was not the first act of Norse aggression, perhaps, not if we count the smaller raids, the stories told in Icelandic sagas or hinted at in Irish annals, but it was the first to be seen not merely as a crime, but as a sign, a turning point, a marker in the flow of time, and from that moment on, the people of the Christian world began to speak of their northern neighbors not simply as traders or travelers or distant curiosities, but as a people apart, defined not by place or blood, but by danger. The word Viking began to take on shape, not just as a verb, to go raiding, but as a kind of shadow name, a whisper spoken with caution, a presence that might appear at any coastline, on any morning, without warning. And yet, the truth was more complex. For the men who raided Lindisfarne were not emissaries of chaos, nor devils in human form, but human beings shaped by a different world, drawn by the lure of wealth and weakness, by the stories they had heard, by the opportunity they saw, and while the Christian world saw desecration, they may have seen only a target, only reward for risk, only the fulfillment of a journey begun long before their ships touched shore. Still, for those who mourned what was lost, such understanding came too late. The bells had been broken. The books had been scattered. The relics had been taken. The blood had soaked into the ground. And in the silence that followed, something old had ended. Not the church. Not the kingdom. But the sense that time was safely held in sacred hands. That the rhythm of the world would continue as it had. With prayer at the center and the sea at the edge. Now, the sea had moved inward. And it would not be turned back. Part 7. The Age That Followed. When the ships were gone, and the tide had swallowed the footprints, and the smoke had drifted out to sea and vanished into the sky, there remained only silence, and in that silence the world began, slowly and with unease, to shift, not because the attack on Lindisfarne was the most violent act that would ever be committed, nor because it destroyed the greatest treasure, nor because it ended the lives of kings or altered the borders of nations, but because it struck a place believed to be beyond the reach of violence, and by doing so, it changed not only what people feared, but what they believed about time itself, for the rhythm of days that had stretched quietly from one century into the next was broken, and something new had begun, though few at the time could say exactly what it was. The year 793, once simply a number in the long line of annals, became instead a threshold, a doorway, a marker of change, and though the word Viking Age would not be spoken by those who lived then, who only saw their present and not our categories, it is that year, and that place, and that morning by the sea, that historians have returned to, again and again, as the moment when the age began, not because it was the first rate in truth, but because it was the first whose echo was recorded so clearly, whose consequences were felt so deeply, whose meaning stretched far beyond the island where it occurred. And so, the age that followed would not be an age of peace. For in the years after Lindisfarne, more ships came, not always from the same place, not always to the same shores, not always with the same intent, but they came nonetheless, to other monasteries, to coastal towns, to markets and estuaries, and soon what had once seemed unthinkable became simply real, and what had once been seen as an isolated horror became instead a pattern, a presence, a fact of life. Other kingdoms, too, would feel it: Wessex, Mercia, East Anglia, the Picts in the north, the Irish monastic houses whose sacred texts were carried off, the Frankish coastlines where alarms were raised with growing regularity, and even further still, on the banks of the Seine and the Loire, across the North Sea to Frisia and the Low Countries, and far down the rivers of the east toward the Slavic lands and the gates of Byzantium, where the longships came not as curiosities, but as challengers. And with each appearance, the shape of the threat evolved, not merely raiders, but explorers, settlers, traders, mercenaries, rulers, and with each year, the line between attack and ambition blurred, until it was no longer easy to say where the violence ended and the empire building began, nor whether the Viking Age was born of cruelty or necessity, of greed or ingenuity, of suffering or survival. What is certain is that Lindisfarne marked the beginning of awareness, of reckoning, of a new relation between the northern sea peoples and the Christian kingdoms to the south and west, and from that point forward, the stories written in Latin script and preserved in monastic libraries began to speak not only of divine matters and royal successions, but of raids, of slaughter, of ships that came with the tide and vanished again before the king's men could be summoned, stories told with fear, with outrage, and sometimes with awe. But it is worth remembering that what began in 793 did not arrive without warning, for in the years before, as we have seen, there were rumors, hints, small incursions noted in Irish chronicles, ships sighted in strange places, stories told in taverns of people whose language none could understand, whose weapons were carved with runes, whose gods were unknown and terrible. But it was only with Lindisfarne that these fears coalesced into something undeniable, something that had touched the holy and made it bleed. And so, when people speak of the beginning of the Viking Age, they speak not only of the act itself, but of the moment when imagination was overwhelmed by reality, when stories became lived experience, when the myth of northern peace shattered and the image of the Norseman, as sailor, as slayer, as shadow on the horizon, entered the shared memory of Europe. Yet, it was never only about violence. In time, the same ships would carry not just warriors, but families, settlers who came to farm, to trade, to live, and Viking leaders would become earls, and kings, and founders of dynasties, and Norsemen would build cities, govern regions, intermarry, convert, and leave behind not only ruins, but laws and names and bloodlines that would remain long after the sails had been furled for the last time. But in those first years, after Lindisfarne, it was the fear that spoke loudest. The fear of what else might come. The fear of what else might be lost. The fear that what had been certain no longer was. And so, the age that followed was not only an age of ships and swords, but an age of remembering, of rewriting the boundaries between us and them, between sacred and profane, between known and unknown. And Lindisfarne, still scorched and shaken, stood not only as a wound, but as a warning. A sign that even islands can be reached. A sign that even saints cannot stop a sail. A sign that the world, once thought safe, had opened, and would not close again for a very long time. Part 8. The meaning of a monastery. A monastery is not merely a place where people live and pray, it is a rhythm, a memory, a vessel for something older than the walls that hold it. It is silence shaped into structure, devotion shaped into duty, and every stone placed by hand is a kind of offering, every prayer whispered before dawn a thread in the great tapestry of belief that stretches beyond time and kingdom and crown. When Lindisfarne was built, it was not with the hope of wealth, nor with the desire for protection, but with the deep conviction that this remote and windswept island could be a bridge between heaven and earth, a space where the distance between the divine and the human might be lessened through prayer, through work, through humility, and it was this vision that drew men to live there, not for comfort, but for closeness to God, not to gain, but to give their lives over to something larger, quieter, more eternal. But over time, even a place of simplicity becomes a place of value, and even a house of prayer can become a house of treasure, not always by design, but because reverence accumulates offerings, and offerings accumulate beauty, and beauty, whether in gold or ink or bone, draws attention, from kings, from pilgrims, from enemies. The wealth of monasteries was not loud, nor lavish, but it was real. Sacred relics, bones of saints, splinters of the cross, vials of holy oil, were housed in boxes carved with care, decorated with silver and ivory and stone. Books were copied by hand, letter by letter, and adorned with pigments drawn from rare minerals and gilded with gold leaf so thin it could float in the air if disturbed. Chalices, censers, altar cloths, rings given by noble patrons, brooches pinned to the robes of bishops. All of these were not intended to impress, but to honor the divine. And yet, to those who did not share the faith, or even to those who did but hungered more than they believed, such places must have looked like easy targets, unwalled, sparsely defended, filled with men who did not carry swords, but staffs, and whose wealth, though sacred to them, could be taken without resistance and carried away in silence. The Vikings, who came first by sea and later by river, saw in these holy places not a sanctum, but an opportunity, an accumulation of objects that could be melted, traded, sold, repurposed, and they may not have known, or cared, about the meaning of a saint's finger bone or the centuries of labor that went into a single gospel book, but they knew what gold looked like, what silver could buy, what carved jewels might fetch in foreign ports. There was also the fact that monasteries were usually placed at the edges of the world, or so it seemed, on remote islands, along river mouths, in the folds between kingdoms, places chosen for their solitude and for the sense of being closer to heaven than to any court, but which, in their very isolation, made themselves vulnerable, visible to those who knew how to read the land, how to listen to the wind, how to follow the cries of seabirds and the curve of the coast until stone walls rose out of the mist and the faint sound of bells gave away what lay within. But the meaning of a monastery was not only found in what it housed, or even in what it protected, it was in what it preserved. The monasteries were memory holders. They were keepers of time in a world where most things were lost. They wrote history, copied scripture, composed music, taught the young, cared for the sick, fed the hungry, and above all, they held the fragile link between one generation and the next, between the word heard and the word remembered, between the world seen and the world imagined. To attack a monastery, then, was not only to take its gold, it was to wound the very structure of Christian society, to sever a thread that ran through kings and commoners alike, to cast doubt on the strength of heaven's watch over earth. And yet, the attackers may not have known this, at least not at first. They may have only seen low buildings and soft targets and sails that could carry their plunder far from reach. But soon, as the raids continued, they began to understand, not just that these places were rich, but that they were feared when burned, and feared more when spared, that their destruction sent ripples through the kingdoms of Europe, shook the crowns of kings, stirred the hearts of bishops, and demanded attention in ways that no battle ever could. So they came again, not only to Lindisfarne, but to Iona, to Jarrow, to Reichenau and Clonmacnoise and Noirmoutier and Fulda. Some they burned. Some they spared. Some they came to settle beside. And always the meaning deepened. Always the message darkened. The monasteries, once only markers of the sacred, became, in the eyes of many, symbols of vulnerability, of loss, of the world as it had been before the sails appeared on the sea. And so, while the monks continued to sing, to write, to pray, perhaps more urgently than before, they also began to build thicker walls, to keep lookouts, to trust less in divine protection and more in stone and sword. And yet, the heart of the monastery never changed. It remained what it had always been, a place where time moved slowly, where silence was not emptiness but fullness, where devotion was not performance but practice, and even when the storms came, even when the books were burned, even when the walls were torn down, the spirit of what had been built there lingered, not in gold, but in memory, not in relics, but in rhythm. A rhythm that still speaks, if one listens, beneath the noise of history. Part 9. Memory and Myth. History, like water, does not hold still, it flows, it shifts, it reflects the light of each new age that peers into it, and so the memory of Lindisfarne, though once rooted in blood and fire and silence, has moved through the centuries not only as fact, but as symbol, as story, as a kind of mirror for the fears and longings of those who came after. What happened on that summer morning in 793 was recorded, yes, in the sober Latin of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, in the sorrowful letters of Alcuin, in annals that tried to hold back emotion even as they bore witness to the unthinkable, but over time, as the words were copied and recopied, as they passed from one monastery to the next, from one historian to another, the outlines of the event began to take on a shape that was no longer just a moment, but a turning point, no longer just a raid, but a beginning. The idea that this single attack marked the start of the Viking Age was not immediate, it came later, as scholars looked back and sought to draw lines, to divide the flow of time into before and after, and so Lindisfarne became a kind of origin myth for an age defined by sails and swords, not because it was the first strike, but because it was the one that was remembered, the one that left behind not only ashes, but meaning. It is remembered because it wounded what was supposed to be inviolable. It is remembered because it forced those who believed themselves at the center of the world to realize that the horizon was no longer safe. It is remembered because it touched something sacred, not just in space, but in time, and what is sacred, once broken, cannot be restored to what it was. In the centuries that followed, the story grew. Monks wrote of it with awe and horror. Kings cited it when raising defenses. Chroniclers returned to it as a warning. And eventually, when the age of raiders had passed into the age of legend, Lindisfarne became the beginning of a larger tale, not only of Norsemen and conquest, but of the fall of innocence, of the arrival of a colder, more dangerous world. Later still, when the word Viking had hardened into an identity, first feared, then romanticized, the image of the raid returned in new forms. In poetry, it was storm and fire. In painting, it was sails in the mist. In fiction, it became the spark that set the North ablaze. And though no one can say for certain what the faces looked like that day, or what words were shouted, or how long the slaughter truly lasted, imagination has filled in the gaps, and in doing so, it has given the event a second life, not only in textbooks, but in stories, in classrooms, in museums, in film, in memory. And yet, there is something fragile in this, something to be handled with care. For myth, while powerful, can sometimes obscure what was most human. It can turn pain into spectacle. It can turn people into symbols. And so, if we are to remember Lindisfarne truly, we must remember not only what it marked, but what it was, an island, quiet at dawn, a home to monks who prayed before breakfast, who wrote by candlelight, who slept with their faces toward the sea, believing not in glory or conquest, but in the long patience of God. We must remember that those who came were not monsters, but men. And that those who died were not martyrs by choice, but victims of a world beginning to turn. We must remember that memory itself is a kind of echo, that each generation hears a slightly different sound, and that even now, more than 1200 years later, we are still listening to what was said that day, not in words, but in silence. So let the story remain. Let the fire rise again in the telling. Let the sails reappear on the water. Let the chant be interrupted, once more, in the mind's ear. But let us also remember to listen slowly, to speak gently, to feel the wind as it was felt then, sharp with salt, heavy with change, and to know that history is not only what happened, but what lingers. And Lindisfarne, small as it is, lingers still. Part 10. What remains? It has been more than 1200 years since that morning when the sea brought strangers to the shore, since the wind carried the cries of monks across the stones of Lindisfarne, since the fire climbed the roof beams and turned scripture into ash, and still, something remains, not the smoke, not the footprints, not the bodies carried away by tide and time, but the feeling that here, in this small place at the edge of the world, something opened that could not be closed. The monastery was rebuilt, in time. Pilgrims returned. Prayers rose again. But they did so in a world that had been altered, not erased, not destroyed, but changed, as stone is changed by water, slowly, steadily, inevitably. The Viking Age came and went. And with it came not only war, but trade, and language, and settlement. And the slow, complex intertwining of peoples who had once thought of each other as shadow and threat. The Norsemen who once came with axes came again with families. Some stayed. Some prayed. Some built churches of their own. And in the centuries that followed, the memory of Lindisfarne became not only a record of loss, but a thread in the long weaving of shared history. English, Norse, Christian, human. Today, the island is quiet again. The tide still comes and goes. The sky is still wide, and the wind still bends the grasses in the same direction. Visitors walk where monks once walked. They sit in the ruins. They read the signs. They try to imagine. And though the stones do not speak, there is a kind of language in them still. In their stillness. In their patience. In the way they wait. Not to be rebuilt, but simply to remain. What remains, then? Not the violence. Not the names of the fallen. Not the plunder carried off in the belly of ships long sunk or rotted away. What remains is the moment itself, suspended in memory. A moment that tells us not only what happened, but what matters. That peace is precious. That the sacred can be shaken. That the sea, for all its beauty, never forgets the paths we carve across it. And perhaps, too, what remains is this: the sound of waves against stone. The weight of morning light on weathered walls. The knowledge that even the smallest place can echo through centuries. And the sense that somewhere, always, a sail is on the horizon. And we are watching. And we are wondering. And we are remembering. And before you drift completely into sleep, or into thought, or simply into stillness, let this be a gentle reminder. What you've just listened to is the fourth part in our summer series on the Viking world. In earlier episodes, we've quietly stepped into their homes, wandered their longhouses, and watched their daily lives unfold like the rhythm of the seasons. We've walked beside a traveler from far away, an Arab observer named Ahmad ibn Fadlan, and through his eyes, we glimpsed the strangeness and ceremony of the north. We've boarded a ship on the open sea and followed the slow, deliberate course of a Viking expedition, feeling the salt in the air, the weight of time, the creak of timber. And now, we've stood on a quiet island and watched the moment the silence broke. If this journey has stirred your thoughts, or brought you calm, or simply carried you gently from one hour to the next, know that there is more to come. More stories. More voices. More slow unfolding. So if you'd like to follow the rest of this series, if you'd like to stay with us as we continue tracing the long shadow of the north, please take a moment, before the tide returns, to like, subscribe, or follow this podcast, so that the next chapter will find you when it's ready. Until then, rest well. The sea is calm again. The stars are rising. And history, as always, waits.